It's super loud.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. In today's seminars, we are glad to have Rafael Pereira here. Rafael will be presenting about GTFS2 model. He's a senior researcher in the fields of urban analytics at the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil, where he leads the data science team. He's also a visiting professor at the geography department here at UT-ITE, and I'm also happy to say that he was my previous supervisor back in Brazil, so I'm really glad to have you here, Rafa. So whenever you want to start.
Thank you, João. Thank you, João, and thank you guys for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. I'm spending a few weeks and months here in Canada, in Toronto, as a visiting professor, and so I'm always glad to have this kind of opportunity to exchange and chat with students and talk about work. So as João said, I'm Rafael Pereira, and I work as a researcher and head of data science at Ipea, the Institute for Applied Economic Research. And Ipea is basically like a think tank linked to the federal government of Brazil. We are kind of that sweet spot between academic research and policy decision making. So we're basically doing academic research that help policymakers make their decisions, but we're also bringing real data and challenges from the policy world into academic research as well. We're trying to make that bridge between both worlds. And a lot of the work that I do is related to data science and spatial data science related to transportation and accessibility and some work on emissions. And I'll be talking today about a emissions model that we developed a couple of years ago. João was a big part of that. And I think you might like, or it might be interested or down the alley of some of the work that you guys are doing. But before I do that, I'd like to start this presentation mentioning that I think it's fair to say we have seen kind of recently we have seen a revolution in mobility data over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And by revolution, I mean we have now much more data or much more easy access to several types of data sets that were not imaginable like 20 years ago. Like nowadays, you can very easily have access to GPS data, mobile phones, smart cards data, traffic cars, portable emission devices. Something that 20 years ago was like unimaginable. Maybe 1 or 2 research centers in the entire country will have that, and now you guys as students or any person with their laptop and the internet can just download a lot of those data and work with it. And despite all the excitement about this revolution in how data has been much more spread and easily accessible to us and different sources of data, I think we speak very little about one specific type of data that is very relevant for transportation, which is GTFS. So GTFS stands for General Transit Feed Specification. And most of you might be already familiar with GTFS, but for those who are not, GTFS is basically a zipped folder with a bunch of text files. It's literally a file.txt. And inside that text file, you have a bunch of columns which are standardized with basic information about your transit system. And so GTFS was created by Google and Portland's Transit Authority in the mid-2000s as a way to standardize public transport data. So GTFS is, you can think of it as like the geolocated timetable of your transit system in a format that has been standardized and a lot of people are using it. And what I mean by the extraordinary thing of this is that GTFS is creating what I call a quiet revolution of transportation data. Because not many people are really talking about GTFS, and yet GTFS has become the most ubiquitous form of public transport data worldwide. Because it's very simple to use, it's very easy for machines to read, and it has become the de facto standard used by pretty much all of the apps we use. Like if you go on your mobile phones or on your laptops, every one of those apps for routing and transit planning, they're all using GTFS at the back end. And it has already been the standard data for hundreds and thousands of cities and agencies across the world. And what is revolutionary about that is the fact that because GTFS has become so commonly spread across the globe by so many transit agencies and cities, this this creates a common ground for learning. So the software that you guys develop here in Toronto to analyze some form or shape of GTFS data can automatically be used by anyone in Tokyo or Indonesia or in Rio de Janeiro. And a routing engine that is developed in Washington, D.C. has great value for anyone in Europe, Asia, Africa, or South America. And that's why I think we talk a lot about GPS data and smart cards and mobile phones data, but we should be talking much more about GTFS as well, because it opens up so much space for possibilities and learning and construction. One of the nice things about the work that I do is that I get to play a lot with GTFS. And I have two big strands of research in my research group. The first one is really looking at access to opportunities, and the other one is looking at transportation emissions. And GTFS is a big pillar in all of those types of work that we do. My seminar today will be mostly about the emission model, but just so you understand, I'm not an emissions person. I'm mostly more like an accessibility person. The emissions model that we've been developing is more like an extra project that's more like João's type of work. I was just working with that in that project. So I will very briefly mention some of the work that we'll be doing on accessibility, and then we'll dive in the emissions model. So back in Brazil, I lead the Access to Opportunities Lab at Ipea, and the basic goal of this is to generate annual estimates of access to employment, healthcare, education, and welfare services for each city block, for all of the largest cities in Brazil, by transportation mode, and we're making all of this available. So just to give you an idea, this is the map of the city of São Paulo in Brazil, and this map shows you the percentage of jobs you can reach by transit within 60 minutes. And you don't need to be familiar with São Paulo. If you just look at this map, you can already know what are the mass transit corridors, what are the subways and the trains or the most important transportation corridors. And I always like to draw your attention to this bright spot here. So this is the Zona Leste, or the east zone of the city of São Paulo, which is very famous for being very poor and economically deprived. And in the middle of an area that's very poor, you have one very bright spot of high accessibility. Can you guys guess what this is?
Airport?
No? But that's a good guess. That's a subway station. So the people here are not really having access to the jobs just here, because they can very quickly enter the subway here. Because they can enter the subway here, they can very quickly access the jobs in the city center. So when we think about this accessibility aspect, we're looking at the spatial temporal connections of the transport systems. It's always about where people live, where the jobs are or the opportunities are, but also about the spatial temporal connectivity of your transport system. You can live very far from the jobs, but if there is a very fast transit connection between you and the jobs, you still can have access to those jobs. And I guess to a large extent, this map kind of illustrates how the performance of your transit network collapses space and time to make things closer to you in a way, right? This is just another quick example of accessibility. We're here looking at the travel time that takes you to go from your house to the closest healthcare facility by transit. So if you live in an area that's very yellow, you take less than 5 minutes. Green areas would take you, or places from where you would take something between 10 and 20 minutes to reach the closest hospital, and dark blue areas would take a lot more than 30 minutes. These are very simple accessibility metrics. We calculate a bunch of accessibility metrics for every city block. This is just for the city of São Paulo, but we are doing this for several years by several transportation modes for several large cities in Brazil, and we're expanding the project now to cover 50% of the country population of the population in the country. We have several outputs from the project and from the lab. Looking at, this is a paper we recently published where we compare access to jobs by different transportation modes across 16 countries in 117 cities comparing, for example, walking access to jobs here. You have the black dots are American cities, North American cities. The yellow dots, or the orange dots, are European cities. The gray dots are Chinese cities, and so on. The green dots are Brazil here. So we have here transit and car and walking, but we didn't have access to cars back then. But just to give you an idea how car accessibility in the US is fairly good, but surprisingly, Chinese cities have much better car accessibility than American cities. So that's something I was not really expecting. And naturally,
which cities on the top right?
The cities here? There's Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Xi'an, Kunming.
Is it the same in other graphs too, the same city on the top right?
Yeah, basically they're all the same cities in the three plots, except for the Brazilian cities where we only have them for walking and transit.
Yeah, so Shanghai is always at the top.
Oh.
Shanghai is always at the top
Yeah.
for both transportation, transportation modes. But then remember, it's sometimes accessibility is not so much about the performance of your transit system, but it's also about the co-location of people and activities. So if there is a very high land use mix with high density, then just simply walking or taking transit, you'll be very... we also develop a lot of R packages and Python packages along the project. This is just a few of them. But I wanted to draw your attention to R5R and R5Pi, which are R and Python packages to do multimodal routing analysis in R and Python, right? So we're leveraging on R5, which is a routing engine, a multimodal routing engine that gives you door-to-door estimates of travel time and travel cost. And R5 is written in Java. Not many people speak Java these days, especially in transport engineering and transportation planning. But a lot of us are using Python and R. And so R5R and R5Pi allows you to leverage or to tap into the power of R5 and do all sorts of routing, travel time matrices, and in a very realistic and sophisticated way. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention is to the AOP data. So AOP data is the R package that brings the data from the Access to Opportunities Lab. Remember I told you we collect and generate all those accessibility estimates for several transportation modes, for several activities in several cities? Well, in R, with one line of code, you can call the function read access for the city of Curitiba, for public transportation, for that specific year. At peak, it's false, so here we're looking at the off-peak period. We want the geometry of the hexagons, and we didn't want to show the progress bar of the download. So with one line of code, you download the data, and with one ggplot, you create this map. Is this the most beautiful map you have ever seen? Definitely not. But, again, you can already see where the most important transit corridors in Curitiba, the famous BRT corridors of the city. And the nice thing about this is you can make your data easily available to more people. And it's very empowering to see a local government official or other students and professors and civil society using this kind of package to tap in your data and use your data for all sorts of analysis. So I'll be moving now to the emissions model presentation. That's the core of what I wanted to talk to you today. But with this, I just want you to remember one thing. If you're doing a PhD or a postdoc, and you're calculating, you're crunching numbers, and you're generating data, you're generating indicators. If you want your paper or your papers to have an impact, do not just publish the paper, publish the data as well. Make your data publicly available as a package or as a website or as an interactive dashboard. Because otherwise the impact your paper will have will be very, very short compared to what it could have. So thinking about developing packages and developing data packages and software packages, it's not just about it's fun to code. It's also about how you get yourself out in the world, how you make your research much more impactful and you have an outreach that you would not have otherwise. So that's my only advice for you. Think about that. Now, going to what we signed for. I was doing a lot of work on accessibility and GTFS, and I had this idea, okay, we're collecting GTFS for several countries, for several cities in Brazil and across the globe. What else can we do with it? Like just beyond looking at access opportunities. And one idea that occurred to me was maybe we could generate the emissions of the transit system. Because if you think about GTFS, what GTFS is really telling you, it is the scheduled services for every single vehicle in your transport system. The GTFS will tell you how many trips each vehicle or each bus will make in your transit system. What time they departure, what time they arrive at each single transit stop, and what is the frequency of the service, and so on and so forth. So you have the distances of the trips, you have the speed of those trips, and you have the frequency of those trips. So you can very easily calculate the vehicle's miles traveled of your transit system. And with that, I thought, maybe we could do something about transport emissions here. And that's when I met João, and I said, João, what do you think about this idea? And he said, yeah, we can do it. And I said, perfect, because I know nothing about emissions, and that's João's background. So we teamed together, and we developed this R package, which is a model and to generate emissions estimates of public transport systems using R. We published this paper in TRD, I think 2 years ago. And the paper basically introduces what the package does, how it operates. But the package lives on GitHub as an R package on CRAN. And if you guys are interested, we could expand it to a Python or Julia package, but at the moment it's only an R package. What I really like about this package is that it is not very data hungry. In fact, any user only needs 2 inputs. So let's say you want to calculate what is the environmental footprint of the transit system of Toronto. You only need 2 things. You need the GTFS of Toronto, which is kind of easy to get. It's publicly available on the website. And you also need a table with some information about fleet characteristics. This could be either a detailed table telling you like, this is number 1 with this and this characteristics, this is number 2 with this and this characteristics, or it could be a general table saying like the composition of your fleet. Like 20% of my fleet is based on buses made in 2024. Or 15 buses were made in 2022 with the standard Euro 4 or standard Euro 5 and so on. So you only need 2 things. What are the characteristics of your fleet and what are the GTFS fleet? Apart from that, you need to indicate in the R package what pollutants you're interested in looking at and what emission factor models you will be using in your analysis. And we currently have emission models for Brazil, Europe, and 2 emission models for the United States, the California and the federal ones. Now, okay, so you have the data. What do? To use the package, you only need 2 steps, and they're very simple steps. You need to first run this step. The step 1 is running the transport model, and step 2 is running the emission model. That's it. Then you're done. So what each step is doing, the first step, or the transport model step, is converting the GTFS feed, which is those bunch of text files in kind of a relational format, relational table format, and it's transforming the GTFS feed into a GPS-like table. It's more like a trajectory table where each line, each row of your table is the timestamp of your vehicle at one moment in time. And without you realizing this, what is running under the hood is another package we created called GTFS to GPS. So the GTFS to GPS package is a package with one single function. It converts a GTFS table to a GPS table like this. And the advantage of this is that machines work very well with GTFS, but humans, we don't. But we work very well with columnar data files like this. So once you convert it to GPS tables, GPS-like tables, you can do all sorts of work that we are used to do. So in this example, for
here we are looking at the space-time trajectories of every single vehicle. Every dot moving here is a vehicle in the transit system of São Paulo. And the nice thing is that we can play with the space-time geography of transit systems. And here we are following the trip of one specific bus, the departure from here at 4 a.m. And every red dot is a transit stop along the schedule of this vehicle. And at 6 in the morning, it arrived at the last stop around here. And we can also think about how different routes are connected in space and time. So 2 different routes that depart at very different parts of this, from very different locations in the city, but eventually at around 7:30, they overlap in some part of the transit network. So in time geography, this is what we call about bundling of activities or bundling of people, where you can have different space-time trajectories that meet together at some point, which allow them to people to connect. And there are all sorts of interesting data visualizations we can do. We published a paper explaining how this package works a couple of years ago as well. And I just wanted to explain this map. So these 2 figures are exactly the same, but one is 2D, the other one is 3D. So according to the United Nations, we have those sustainable development goals. And one of those sustainable development goals is that every person should be close to a transit stop or have access to public transit infrastructure. So we calculated for different times of the day, that's our x-axis, the frequency of the transit services. We divide the city in those hexagons. We know where people live, and we know the income level of every single neighborhood, so to speak. So we calculated what is the average frequency of the transit services that run by every single neighborhood. And let's see whether this frequency of the transit service in rich neighborhoods is higher or lower than in poor neighborhoods. So on the y-axis we have income. At the bottom we have the first income decile where the poorest people live. So these are poorest neighborhoods. These are wealthiest neighborhoods. And these are different times of the day. So it doesn't take a lot of time to look at this and to realize that the average frequency of transit services, they obviously vary along the day. So you have much higher frequency at the morning peak and the afternoon peak. But also they vary a lot if you're in a poor neighborhood or in a high-income neighborhood. And high-income neighborhoods consistently have higher transit services or transit frequency services than poor-income neighborhoods. So again, very simple. This is just calculated with a few. Once you run the GTFS to GPS package, with very few lines of code, you can do this kind of analysis looking at search form of inequalities. But for us, from the beginning, the GTFS to GPS package was always one step towards our ultimate goal, and the ultimate goal was to generate the emission model. So if in the first step we use the table, we're combining it with the fleet characteristics and with emission factor models to generate what is the expected emission that will be coming out of the pipes of every single bus at every single minute of the day at every single stretch of road segment. So this is just one example where we estimated for every single vehicle the expected emission for the city of São Paulo. And here we're zooming in, looking at CO2 emissions and particulate matter. Again, you don't need to know São Paulo very well to immediately look at the map and see what are the most important transit corridors in the city. The package gives you also like a very detailed analysis in space and time, so you can look not only at the spatial distribution of those emissions, but also at the time when they are emitted, in looking at space-time in a more combined manner. The nice thing about this method, about this model, is not only that it worked with very little data, but because it works upon the GTFS standard, you can very easily apply this kind of method to pretty much any city in the world. So here we did some estimates for the city of Houston in the US, and Sydney in Australia, Curitiba in Brazil, and Rome in Italy. So what are some advantages and disadvantages? What are the caveats? Because I'm always talking, so far I've only talking about the good things about the method, and there are lots of limitations as you can imagine. So advantages, like the first one, that it requires very little data. You just need the GTFS and the fleet characteristics, as I mentioned. Because it works on GTFS, you can very easily replicate this kind of method and model to several different cities. We know colleagues in Cairo, this package has already been used a few times, and we know colleagues in Cairo and other cities have already used it to provide. There are a few caveats that are very important, though. The first one is that we're only looking at buses. Unfortunately, we haven't found emission factor models for rail, urban rail. And even though an electrified subway system might not be emitting like CO2 emissions, like hot pipe CO2 emissions, it's still emitting a lot of particulate matter, for example. We are only looking at tailpipe emissions. We're not looking at the life cycle emissions of the transit system, which is always a partial picture that we can bring to the table. At the moment, we do not account for elevation or terrain elevation and gradient or load, like the number of passengers in the bus. If the bus is fully loaded with passengers, or if the bus is running empty, this will have an important effect on the emission level, but we're not accounting for that. And we currently do not account for idle and congestion effects, and that's also a small problem in the model. But I guess to a large extent, these caveats are kind of pointing us towards what are the next directions we should be heading in terms of improving the model. So moving forward, apart from improving on those caveats and trying to address them, we want to do an environmental benchmark of transport systems across the globe. So this is a project we've been thinking about for a few years now, and hopefully Juan will carry the torch and do this work as part of his thesis at some point. But we're hoping we'll be looking at, let's say, 40 or 50 cities across several countries in the globe, and we'll be looking at the environmental footprint of their public transport systems. Not only looking at how much emissions they have, but also the emissions per passenger, and how perhaps urban form characteristics or network characteristics might be affecting or influencing the environmental performance of those transit systems. This kind of tool is also very interesting in the sense that it can help you very easily evaluate the potential environmental benefits of policy scenarios. Let's say, what if we renewed our fleet 20% of our buses? So we have 20% of our buses are very old, and we'll replace them with Euro 5 or Euro 4 standards. Or let's say you electrify 10% of your fleet, or one specific route in your transit system. And once these environmental emissions are estimated, they could be integrated into environmental exposure models to look at what kind of neighborhoods or social demographics are more or less exposed to public transport emissions. And again, we need to incorporate some emission factor models from rails and incorporate address the terrain elevation and congestion effects. But these are just some general ideas that we have. Again, the paper was published just 2 years ago, but the model is kind of a live project, and it's in constant improvement, so to speak. So if you have any questions or suggestions, João would be glad to address them.
Thanks, Rafa.